Hello everyone, and welcome to Section 2, Risk and Odd Ratio. In the last section, we learnt about hazard ratio and its usage. In this section, we will learn about two important ratios, i.e. risk and odd ratios, and their usage with examples. Odd ratio. Odds ratios are calculated using binary outcomes, i.e. where one of only two things can happen, and logistic regression. The main difference between this and the other two measures is that there is no way of including a time element in the model. Odds ratios are best used if follow-up time is fixed. For example, if the outcome is measured at a specific follow-up visit or you have a case control study. Odds ratio equals the odds in the intervention group divided by the odds in the control group. Another slightly clunky interpretation here too. As an example, an odds ratio of 1:1 would suggest a 10% increase in the odds of the outcome in the intervention group than the control group. Let's understand a little bit more about odd ratios by taking an example of the linkage between smoking and lung cancer. Let's say we were trying to establish whether or not there is a link between smoking and lung cancer. Our sample can be split into four groups: exposed with cancer, exposed without cancer, unexposed with cancer, and unexposed without cancer. Odds ratios are most commonly used in gambling and are calculated with the equation below. In our example in the table, the odds ratio would be calculated as below. Whereas probabilities can only adopt a value between 0 and 1. Odds may have any value from 0 to infinity. Risk ratio. Relative risks are also called risk ratios, possibly to avoid the naming confusion. They are calculated using Poisson regression, and also use event data. The main difference between this and hazard ratios is that Poisson regression usually uses counts for an event that can happen multiple times. An example of this would be the number of epileptic seizures a person has during a follow-up. This type of model also allows for following people up for a variable amount of time. Relative risks, or risk ratios, have a more intuitive interpretation as you simply interpret it as a ratio. For example, a relative risk of 1.5 would suggest a 50% increase in risk, whereas a relative risk of 0.5 would suggest a 50% decrease in risk. Let's understand a little more about hazard ratios by taking the same example of the linkage between smoking and lung cancer. Let's say we are trying to establish whether there is a link between smoking and lung cancer. Our sample can be split into four groups: exposed with cancer, exposed without cancer, unexposed with cancer, and unexposed without cancer. Risk ratios, or relative risks, are one way of comparing two proportions. They are calculated with the following equation. From the data in the table, the risk ratio is calculated like so. This means that the risk of developing lung cancer is 2 times greater in the exposure group than in the control group. A risk ratio of 1 implies that there is no difference, and a ratio of less than 1 would imply that the exposure had a protective influence over the outcome. In this section, we learnt about risk and odd ratio, and their importance and usage. In the next section, we will learn about the importance of number needed to treat and harm.